The Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Welcome everybody to our latest Provoke Media CCO podcast. This one features Michael Gonda, the Chief Impact Officer for McDonald's, and was recorded live at our North American Summit in Chicago, where Michael discussed the past 12 months at McDonald's and the various issues the company faced.
Thank you so much.
It's great to have you here. Thank you.
I have to start by just saying, not to grab the stage, but I started in the industry always hearing about the Holmes report. And when Paul Holmes was in the building, it was very intimidating. I was never in that room with Paul. I was in a cubicle in the recesses of the floor, but it is really an honor. Thank you for thinking of me and McDonald's for this.
So this makes it clear to me that you were in the agency world at that time, because in the agency world, Paul Holmes is still maybe intimidating. I find it difficult to believe.
think so. I mean, I'm intimidated right now, so yeah.
But in the corporate world, let's face it, Paul Holmes is who? So
I see where you're going.
That's very nice of you. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start just by talking a little bit about your role at McDonald's, because obviously, from my perspective, I would consider you part of the public relations / communications business that we cover, but your title is Chief Impact Officer. What does that mean?
I'm still trying to figure that out too, so maybe we can sort it out together. It feels very much like a title for now, and I'm not sure where it goes in the next couple of years. But I think there's a good reason for bringing these functions together. And I also just want to thank you all for taking the time to come and be here this morning. It is an honor to be able to share a bit about McDonald's. We started an impact function about 3 years ago. And the recognition was government relations, communications, philanthropy and sustainability, community engagement. Those were spread out across the company. And whenever there was an opportunity we wanted to go address, an example of that is our Archways to Opportunity Scholarship Program. We wanted to make sure the world knew about that. We wanted to make sure that the program was staying modern and meeting the needs of young people today who were seeking careers at McDonald's or educational pursuits, that there was one team that could go and tell that story and change those actions. And the reality is we were spread out across 4 or 5 different departments. And that made it, I think, really hard for our CEO and then our business leaders to find a single point of accountability. So we formed the impact team to be responsible for the actions and the messages. And so far, I'm about 3 years into my role, and I think last year was testament to this. It's worked pretty well. Nothing is perfect. Nothing in corporate America is perfect, but it's enabled us to work with more precision and more speed than I think we previously did.
And what's the relationship between the impact function and the communications function? Obviously, there are areas of overlap and convergence. How's that structured?
When we first started, there was a sense of why are we all in the tent together? Why? For those who started in government relations, they saw themselves as hardened professionals who were lobbyists by trade. Why am I in a weekly meeting with communications? And I think, I sit on our US leadership team, and sometimes when I'm in a meeting with our CFO, I wonder why I'm in the meeting with him too. So different disciplines may not always see themselves working together. An insight early on when I started, when I asked the GR team, what do you do for the brand? What is your contribution to the business? This is true on the state and local side. It was, the first half of the year we're in session and we are trying to identify opportunities or threats to the brand. And the rest of the year, we are building a reputation. I was like, oh, interesting. What are you doing to help build McDonald's reputation? Telling our story. Great. Did you know that next week we're launching a national campaign that is all about being a crew person at McDonald's? We call it 1 in 8. So 1 in 8 Americans have worked at McDonald's. And the answer was no. It's like, Isn't that annoying? I mean, your job is to drive reputation for this company, and you have no idea that this suite of tools could be at your disposal. And I think as we found more and more examples like that, there has been a much closer collaboration across disciplines that started by saying, why are we all in the room together? Why are we doing an annual plan together? Does that answer that?
Yeah, I think so. It does make me wonder how many companies haven't figured out sort of how to bring those disciplines together for maximum effect, because I've always felt that our function is uniquely prone to what, if you'll forgive me for a sort of weird Cold War European term, balkanization, that you end up with, investor relations over here reporting into finance, and employee communications reporting into HR, and public affairs reporting to the legal department, and corporate communications sort of catching whatever isn't part of those things, and there's a lack of coordination. But I think maybe the better way to understand what it is that you do and what it is you bring to the company is for us to talk about some of the seminal events from last year at McDonald's, because it felt like from the beginning of the year to the end, your name was being caught up in or associated with a whole plethora of important political, social, economic issues, which is inevitable when you're as ubiquitous as McDonald's obviously is. And I think there's some interesting themes that we've talked about that emerge from that, from the challenges of doing centralized communication in an environment where franchisees have a tremendous voice in the company, and also the ability to turn crisis into opportunity, which I think is a sort of theme of 3 or 4 of the incidents that you dealt with last year. And I wanted to start at the beginning of the year with the economic issues that America was facing at the time, the fears of inflation, the reality of inflation, and the fact that, as a company that is, to a certain extent, associated with affordable dining, it was becoming an issue for McDonald's. So tell me a little bit about how that issue started to affect the company and how you formulated a response.
We, early in the year, it became clear that we were starting to lose a really important cohort that makes up about 20 to 30% of our daily visits. And those were individuals from households that have income of $45,000 or less. And you see that the challenge that cohort was dealing with, it's not just exclusive to them, but the pain, the challenge that they were facing was acutely present and visible with that cohort. And they stopped showing up. And it was clear to us that our pricing was a barrier to get people into our restaurants. Now, you mentioned that we're a franchise brand. It's a really important fact. About 95% of McDonald's restaurants are not owned by the corporation. That means we don't set prices. We can recommend prices as part of national advertising, but we can't say everyone around the world or everyone around the country should sell chicken nuggets for this one price. So when you're seeing data that says a really important cohort is not showing up, the first thing you have to do is to convince your operators, your stakeholders, in this case our franchisees, that we needed to launch a national program, a value menu, and we called it a $5 meal deal. Now, we knew that probably in like January, February. That meal didn't become available to Americans until May, which was a really, really long time. And in that time, you started to see headlines about people not having money to go out. You saw headlines about an $18 Big Mac that was all over, at least it felt to me like that was all over the place. And you continued to see a degradation of people who you expected to come and visit you or visit us. So we had to take a kind of a two-part approach. One, we knew this program was going to launch, and we had to hold out for as long as we could before that was out in the wild. The second thing is we had to correct some misinformation. We became a bit of a political football. Anyone on the left that wanted to find an example of corporate greed would say, there's your $18 Big Mac. That is the example of corporate greed. Discount the fact that that was coming from a franchise restaurant off of a singular location that was in a turnpike in Connecticut. So not necessarily representative of national prices. But we became an attack. We were attacked from that side. On the right, this was all of the failures of Bidenomics manifesting. And we were in a really difficult position because we knew this program was going to launch, but faith and trust in the brand was just slowly eroding, and coverage and conversation was getting worse and worse.
Can I ask you a quick sort of interruption question? How do you measure faith and trust in the brand? And is it close enough to real time that you can make decisions?
It doesn't. Well, it depends. We're going to get to E. coli in a moment. You could see degradation in sales and degradation in trust going, and volume of coverage, and there's a really clear line across all of them. This was probably less of a clear correlation. It wasn't like on one day something happened, or the day of a headline about Big Macs, and all of a sudden people stopped coming out. So you had to try to pick different pieces of data to put the story together. And what we ultimately decided is we were going to launch this bold program, and we were going to get more front-footed about the myths and the facts about our pricing strategy. And our U.S. president for McDonald's USA authored a letter that said, listen, we hear you. Prices have gotten out of control, and we're going to do something about it. At the same time, we are seeing tweets from different elected leaders, studies that really weren't sound at all in their rigor, that have a lot of misinformation in it. And we went point by point on that misinformation. Now, I was interested to see many people in our industry say, that is a terrible idea. It's defensive, it's picking a fight, it feels complanatory. I mean, proud of authorship, but I disagree. I think that when you know you're about to do something, it's really important to clarify the misinformation and say something clearly and succinctly. And we saw that take some of the anxiety out of the conversation. And I think it actually helped consumers who were worried, even if the $18 Big Mac isn't showing up in my local store, is it coming next week? We were able to say that that was not the case. In fact, a $5 meal deal was coming next week.
Right. So that was, from my perspective, as a casual observer, the first of many times that I saw McDonald's in the headlines associated with, tangential to, crisis that was clearly an American crisis.
Yeah.
The next incident that registered with me was the controversy that sprang up around Kamala Harris's resume, and the fact that McDonald's hadn't been on there, but then she mentioned that she'd worked in McDonald's in her youth. Interest of full disclosure, my first job when I was politely asked to leave my high school was as a busboy in a pub in Lancaster, England, not Pennsylvania, and I have never once mentioned that on a resume or a job application or anything else, and that didn't seem at all peculiar to me. But it clearly seemed...
We're going to put it on your Wikipedia now, though.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm sure that ChatGPT is already telling people about it. But it became a source of controversy. There was an accusation that it was fabricated. There didn't seem to be any proof one way or another. And again, McDonald's was dragged into the story to a certain extent. And then we can talk a little bit about the later development. So tell me about how you initially monitored that issue and decided whether or not to speak to it?
Yeah, so I mentioned 1 in 8. And for us, that is a source of real pride. 1 in 8 Americans have worked at McDonald's. So then when you see and hear the Vice President of the United States talking with pride about her experience and what that enabled her to go on and do and the confidence that gave her, that, I mean, for so many of us in the building and I think across the country, we felt pride. As practitioners, as communicators, we also felt excited because we were trying to get that story out there for a while. And the Vice President was really proud and effective. In the DNC, I think we were mentioned 4 or 5 times. So it was a humbling moment, like a really humbling moment to see that come about. Now, we also serve 90% of the population every year. And it's, I think, lost on no one here that we live in a very polarized environment. So if we are seen as picking any side, we know that we are very likely going to be offending a significant number of our customers. And I think that makes our brand a little bit different. I've worked at other brands where we took much clearer and more specific political views because of who our customers were and what they wanted to see from the brand. McDonald's is different. And McDonald's needs to attend to many, many, many people with different ideologies and different beliefs. In terms of the tracking, I think there was a lot that we did to just understand how much conversation there was and was not, really more around 1 in 8 than about the Vice President. But we also knew that there just wasn't a big role for the brand to play. And I got inundated with emails from different suggestions of ways we could capitalize on the Vice President's inclusion, and none of that felt authentic or right for the brand. This was something that was part of her story, and we didn't want to interfere or step in. And we also didn't have the ability, which we ultimately said, to get into did the Vice President work there or not, just because of how long ago that was. And I don't know if you have colleagues at your pub. Do they still remember you? So we reached these similar challenges. I worked at a liquor store at my college, and I don't think any of my colleagues could attest to that. So that was something that we wrestled with, and we knew that by saying something, we could have easily been seen to be trying to wade in, and we didn't want to get anywhere near that. Our brand is a great brand. It does terribly in the culture wars, and that, I think, became a bit of a culture war.
Okay, so that leads me to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, because despite not wanting to get dragged into it, you sort of did eventually, right? Because one of your franchisees, and this speaks to the issue that I was talking about earlier, one of your franchisees decided to invite Donald Trump to Flip Burgers for a photo op, which was clearly designed to troll Harris around the claim that Trump clearly didn't believe. How did that happen, and how do you deal generally with those issues that you may have a corporate position that is strictly neutral, but you have thousands of franchisees around the country, some of whom presumably have very strong opinions one way or another and have the latitude to act on those decisions, and by doing so impact the corporate reputation?
Yeah. Well, that was a unique situation. So I would say that there is no playbook for that one. That visit was, I know this because it was the day before we announced the E. coli visit. I think it was October 20th. And from April-ish to October, we did have a playbook, and we shared it with all of our franchisees. And it was 9 specific points about keeping the brand safe in an election cycle. And part of that was not hosting political activity in a restaurant, because back to this point of we serve 90% of the population, we are not a political brand. Political engagements in our restaurants just don't work well for us. They're not scalable, they're not repeatable, it could be counterproductive. We do regularly welcome and invite elected leaders to our restaurants. And that's really important, because we want people to know and see and understand what it means to run a McDonald's restaurant, what it means to work at a McDonald's restaurant, what it means to frequent a McDonald's restaurant. So opening our doors to everyone is important. It's also a core value of ours. So that's some background. There was a playbook, probably not relevant for this situation. We got a call the week before this visit, letting us know that a franchisee had been approached by local law enforcement asking for the president to be able to come and visit. And as anyone can imagine, you kind of get these things through like a text message or an email. You're like, wait, so I'm sorry, are we talking about visiting a specific location in Pennsylvania? It's like, yeah, we think so. We're still trying to work out more. And I was actually on a flight. And I was like, okay, well, let's see what more information we can gather, and we'll talk when we land. And it was clear that an offer was, at least the ask was made, and the offer was extended. And then comes the question of, well, what do you do about it? Closing our door to an elected leader or a presidential candidate for a major party, that felt like the wrong thing to do when we have been clear about allowing elected leaders previously to come into our restaurants. And we'd have to start explaining why we were adjudicating on this specific instance. So we were going to support the franchisee in facilitating this visit. The question then becomes, well, how do you do it? And how do you explain to people what's going on? We decided that we were not going to talk a lot in advance. The campaign, I think, leaked, we believe, or it got out, the location of the restaurant on Wednesday. The visit was on Sunday. It's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. 5 longest days of my life. As we're trying to figure out just all of the different movements and steps that this would entail. The one thing that was really important to me is that when we spoke clearly and decisively about why we did this, or why this happened, and what it means for the brand. And what it meant for the brand is that McDonald's is deeply important to 2 very, very, very important people, one of whom would be the leader of the free world. And our role is making sure that they understood what it means to run an independent franchise location and what it means to work at McDonald's, and to make clear that to our employees and other stakeholders that this was not a political event that we had gone and secured, but rather a decision that was made by an independent business owner in Bucks County. The reception to the line, "We are not red, but blue, but golden," blew me away. Like that was, we write, I have a colleague of mine in the second row here, we write emails a lot at McDonald's. We put letters out a lot. It is word overload at times. This was a letter that I think just surprised us internally because it seemed to have struck a chord. And I think that chord was people wanting to see brands try to rise above the political fray. So I hope we did it in this situation, but it was definitely a tightrope.
Yeah, it does speak to the difficulty, if not impossibility, of staying out of politics, though, because once the letter had been received, whatever you decided was going to be perceived by one side or the other as a political act, right? If you closed your doors, the Republican candidate would have made a huge deal out of it.
Absolutely. It would have been a political statement.
If you opened your doors, Democrats would assume that you were taking sides. And that's the fascinating reality for me that brands are dealing with today, is that neutrality is almost impossible. The needle is so fine to thread that it's a big challenge.
I totally agree, and I think it would have definitely been seen as a political statement had we tried to stop it. We also made sure that the Harris campaign knew that our franchisees were eager to have the vice president at their restaurant as well. So I think it is hard to be neutral, but I think you have to work really hard at trying to be even-handed, and that was what we certainly worked on.
So that leads us right up to the E. coli crisis.
Yeah.
Right. And last year, I forgive me, don't remember where I read the statistic about food recalls, but it certainly set a record for the number and severity of food recalls across the U.S. And this was perhaps the most high profile. not because it was the most serious necessarily, but because it was McDonald's. And, people pay more attention to McDonald's than they do to Boar's Head, for example.
Yeah.
But tell me a little bit about...
A low bar, but we're clearing it.
Tell me a little bit, thank you. Tell me a little bit about how that crisis sort of came onto your radar and how quickly and assertively you were able to respond to it. Because when I talked to your peers for our crisis review earlier this year, there was a feeling that you'd sort of not only followed the playbook, but updated it for a real-time social media age.
Well, it is humbling to hear that as well. It was the minute we landed in Vegas for a franchisee meeting, it was clear that there was a food safety incident. And when you work at a restaurant company or any food company, I was at a packaged goods company before, that is the number one fear that you have every day. It's emotional for people who work at the company. It's personal, and it becomes scary. I mean, you're hearing reports of hospitalizations and illness. So I want to go back to the first question you asked about impact, because I think our ability to respond in this one had a lot to do with how we were organized. We weren't siloed across GR, across communications. We were able to really work together, and together right at the beginning. That became very important. The second thing is our leadership team had spent a lot of time in the 2 years before that on developing shorthand and trust amongst the various different parties. So my connection and collaboration with our head of supply chain didn't have to begin on the 21st of October. And if it did, I think we would have been toast. Similarly with our the head of the US business, there was trust, and he understood and knew the value and the role that each of us could play. So there was a lot of work that went in to us being able to respond effectively as a whole company, as a system. We got the call from CDC. The way this works is they say we're picking up quote unquote signals, and they're getting clusters. Those signals are reports of a specific type of illness, and then in a specific geography. And they start interviewing people and saying, what have you eaten? And the first few, that list is really long. Then they start to get like 4 or 5 different top common foods. And the question is, have you had a quarter pounder? Have you had Boar's Head? And they called us and said, we're confident that that there is enough connections here that you need to take action. What I'm proud of is that there was no debate in the company about whether we should just look at one ingredient or try to contain this as much as possible. We ended up pulling proactively the item, the quarter pounder, in the affected area. So I think we went above and beyond right out of the gate. That was so important to maintaining trust with CDC and other health authorities.
Sorry, just to kind of circle back to one of the themes here, management was able to unite presumably around the company's values and principles that you discussed in the past. What about franchisees? Was there any pushback or reluctance in the franchisee community to act with that kind of alacrity?
Short answer, no, but the approach there needed to be discussed. And we were in a meeting with 1,000 franchisees in Las Vegas as this was all happening. So me, the head of our supply chain, our US president, went on stage and said, all right, you're about to get notification in the next few minutes that we'll be recalling quarter pounders in about 900 restaurants. And what we all aligned on, company and franchisees, are 3 phases to managing this approach. And I'll be honest with you, we made them up right on the spot. Phase 1 was rapid response. And that was, we were going to do everything we could to demonstrate to public health authorities that our singular focus was on public health. The second phase would be around resumption of selling the product. And the third phase would be on recovering any reputational impact. What we were concerned about, and this was a discussion with our franchisees, is people start confusing what phase we were in. If we started in phase 1 by saying, we're the safest food brand in the world, we have never had a food safety incident, that would be a lot like an airline saying right after an incident, this is the first time this has happened. It doesn't really sit well with the individual who's getting on a plane.
Yeah.
So we wanted to really own it and take responsibility in phase 1 and not try to be defensive. Phase 2, we would get product back on, and phase 3, we would start to rebuild and regain trust that we definitely lost as a result of this food safety incident. So I think the debate with the franchisees was just explaining to them that we would go out and tell our story, but we weren't going to do that in the initial response.
Right. Right. It must be difficult to have patience. We've talked about this now twice, so maybe that's a theme as well. That you know what your plan is, you have a strategy. It's a strategy that will evolve over time, just as the recession $5 deal evolved over time, and in what is now a sort of spectacularly real-time environment in which people start to second-guess companies 10 minutes into an event rather than 10 days or 10 weeks. It must be incredibly difficult to have that discipline and to hold the line as a crisis is evolving, and you have a plan, but you can't necessarily unveil it to everybody.
I think, one of the best parts of my job is the fact that I work at a franchise business, because I get to interact with small business owners all across the country. That said, when something like this happens, it's personal. It is their personal livelihood that this is impacting. So it adds a different level of emotion. And it's on us, it's on me, to be able to address that reality. Make sure that people know that I am acutely aware of what they are going through, and that we've got a plan that can get them through it. And there's crisis playbooks, and we have them for our company. I've developed them in my time at the agency for other companies, and they're helpful guides, but every situation is unique to the time that you're in, the environment you're in, the brand that you're working for, and the situation. And we had to, I think, take a very contemporary approach to trying to get our story out there as quickly as we could. Phase 1 being, we own this and we're taking responsibility.
Right. The other thing that impressed me was how fast, articulate, and on message the non-communications people involved in this were. And the two voices that stood out were your head of supply chain and your North American CEO, who were recording videos, providing updates, speaking with both empathy and authority. How much of that was something that you had prepared for, and how much of it was just two people in the leadership team really rising to the challenge?
There definitely wasn't a checklist that we were relying on. So I would be reluctant to say that we prepared for it, but it was clear. I think there's kind of an intuitive sense for everyone at the company that our brand holds a very special place. Not to be too reverent about it, but it is. It's an important brand. So when something happens that is disruptive, disappointing, we have to address the emotions, not just the facts. And that gets done through individuals getting in front of a camera, saying, 1, that we own it, 2, that it's safe, that we know that we've gotten all contaminated product out of our supply chain, and 3, we are going to work with every single person in public health authorities, the federal level, the state level, to make sure that this can't happen again. Right. And I think you need someone, a voice, to convey that. So that didn't take too much hand-wringing to be like, hey, Joe, or Joe's our head of the U.S. business, Cesar Pena is our head of supply chain. It wasn't like, what do you mean we need to go do this? It was more like, okay, when? And the when began immediately, and then we flew back to Chicago from Vegas, and Joe was on Today's Show within about 6 hours.
Right. And again, from my perspective as an outsider, the turnaround from there's a recall to we're confident that we can bring this product back was really short, right? You moved extremely quickly. Did that create its own challenge that people would say, well, that got fixed suspiciously quickly? How did you deal with bringing the product back?
We tried to bring reporters along on the journey with us. The first day we held a briefing call. I think we sent it out 20 minutes before the invite, and we had like 300 people join the call. And we did that 4 times throughout the first week. What we tried to explain to them was, one, we don't think this is about any sort of lapse in cooking procedures, otherwise you would have seen a much more widespread problem. This is being contained, and not to downplay it at all, but we serve in that time frame 2 million quarter pounders. We had reports of illness, were about 20 at the time. So 20 on a base of millions, we knew it was pretty contained. And we tried to really explain that to reporters and make sure they understood, along with health officials, why we were confident that we'd isolated it. We had taken that facility out of our supply chain, and by the time we got to resumption, they weren't questioning whether or not that was prudent or putting profit over people. So I think that helped significantly. Customers, we needed to make sure that when they walked into a restaurant and they had a question, they got answers to it. And that's really hard to do when you're working with, we have about 800,000 people in the country who wear a McDonald's uniform. To train 800,000 people on message is hard.
Let me ask you a question about that, because you talk about reporters, and I wonder the extent to which the media landscape that you deal with in a crisis has changed, right? So in times of crisis, is it in fact still the mainstream legacy media that have the biggest impact on trust and credibility? Or did you also involve people in either alternative media, independent media, or even influencers in that process?
I think it's an and, so it wasn't one over the other. But when you're dealing with food safety issues, I think reporters, traditional media, still carry a lot of weight and water. And what we talked about in the company is we need to see them as performing a public service. We had franchisees ask us what they should do when reporters come to their restaurants and set up live shots. And our answer was thank them and offer them coffee. They're there to try to educate the public on what is safe and what is not. And I do think, and I think this is true for other industries, aviation, others, I think traditional media is very important. It's not to diminish alternative media and influencers, but I don't think I'm fully there yet to say you don't need to prioritize traditional media.
Right. So the final sort of crisis or inflection point that I wanted to talk about was the DEI issue. And I think it's fair to say that given the number of, or the percentage of African American consumers who come into McDonald's every day, given the fact that you have featured Black people and people of color extensively in your marketing and advertising, a lot of people were shocked when the announcement was made that you were abandoning diversity and equity as goals. So tell me a little bit about that decision and how you came to it.
Yeah. Thank you, because I think there's some really important nuance in what we did and what we didn't do. And I think some of that nuance just understandably gets lost when it's reported. It became clear that some programs, like aspirational goals, were going to fall victim to legal scrutiny, separate public scrutiny for a second, if they weren't modified. And we made the decision as a company that we would look to remove the smallest parts of the most questionable programs, i.e. aspirational goals, while still preserving the totality of our work on inclusion. We're a brand that is 70 years old now. We were promoting the power of diversity in our employee ranks, in our franchisee body, in our suppliers, like well before the acronym was coined. And I believe that our leadership across those three, we call them the legs of the stool, will continue well after any announcement that we made. What got lost to me, and I'm not saying this to complain at all, is what stays in place at McDonald's. Because I think there are some companies that have taken a much more aggressive kind of, I'd say, hatchet approach to their what do you call it, DE&I work, and that was not us. I would show you a fact sheet if I could project it that showed everything that was in place that is remaining today. And it's like 95% of the work. That didn't get articulated well. I think we can take responsibility for that. I don't blame the media, but I think that the nuance just didn't come through there. And the next week, we were faced with a lawsuit for a scholarship program that's been in place for about 40 years now called ASER, and it promotes individuals who have parents that identify as being Latino and Hispanic. And this program has given $33 million in its time. I mean, there are many, many people in the country who have gone to college purely because ASER exists. Now, we got sued for that. And we had a fork in the road decision. Do we go and challenge that in court with a probably unlikely chance of success? We could, though that would mean one thing. There's a temporary restraining order in place. Anyone that had applied for scholarships and they were hoping to get those scholarships to go to school this coming fall, they would not get them. And likely no one would get them next year or the year after that. Or do we look to adjust and modify that program? Right. And the only thing I'll say there is that adjustment and that modification, which we did, enabled the program to continue. And I think that's true when you look at McDonald's inclusion work. We removed aspirational goals because we thought that would definitely fall victim to legal scrutiny, but we're continuing so much of the work. And we're not looking for credit. We're just looking for the operational flexibility to keep doing that work.
So DEI exists because the prior situation was clearly discriminatory, right? Without DEI, companies, whether through unconscious bias or something more systemic, were over-promoting from a select class of people who looked like everybody else at the top of the company. This is obviously, DEI has a 40-year history. This is going back a long way in history. But how do you, without aspirational goals, without some sort of program that has metrics, how do you avoid a return to good old-fashioned racism, which I would suggest is the agenda here?
A lot within that question. And I think
yes, and we have 2 minutes and 26 seconds in which to answer it. So I realize I'm being unreasonable.
I think when you look at the progress that this company has made over 70 years, a lot of that happened without aspirational goals. So I can't speak for every company. I don't want to pierce the argument that you made, but I don't know that that necessarily would apply to McDonald's. So I would say that. The second piece, the force of gravity, is accountability. We have committed to continue to be transparent and to continue to report demographic data across our franchisees, across our supplier spend, across our employees. If our employees start to see massive declines in those numbers, I think that will be a pretty strong driver of accountability. Many companies are not continuing to report that data. We've articulated and communicated that we will continue to do so.
Great. Okay. I'm not sure. We have 1 minute and 23 seconds left because you were remarkably economical with that question. So let me ask you, what has the reaction been, and has it surprised you? Or
I think my learning from this is that we need to be really clear with our communication. Similar to the E. coli communicate. I mean, there's a lot that a food scientist would want to say about E. coli and whether or not you're likely to get it everywhere you eat onions. That wouldn't have fit very well in a singular post on Instagram that would try to convey confidence to a consumer that it's safe to eat food or our food. I think when it comes to the changes we made, the learning is we said a lot, and we probably could have been simpler, and focused on what continues, not just what goes away.
Yeah. Great. Well, that was a really fascinating journey. I can't believe all that was in 12 months. We didn't even get to what I thought was the most exciting thing, which was Grimace showing up at New York Mets games and helping my team make the playoff for the first time in like 20 years.
You're going to out me for not knowing a single thing about sports right now.
So. No, that's Grimace. Not my intention. Sure. Yeah. But
Thank you for this.
He became a cult figure in New York over the summer. Let's leave it at that.
I do watch our social media trends. So yeah,
it was, and the thing is, I'm guessing that 2025 is going to be almost as tumultuous as 2024 was for you and for a lot of other brands. And I want to thank you for
I think we all hope you're wrong, but we'll be ready for it.
for taking us on a journey. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you very much.
It was great. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Provoke podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.